Hello everyone, and welcome to part 3 of A Victory Garden for Maine, brought to you by the University of Maine Cooperative Extension. My name is Cara, and with me today are Marjorie, Becca, and Laurie. In this video, we will be discussing preparing your garden soil. Marjorie, you have the first question.
Thanks, Cara. So I've picked my garden site and I've killed the sod. What do I need to do to prepare the soil before I plant?
The first step I always recommend is taking a soil test. A soil test will give you information on your soil's pH and nutrient levels. It will also tell you what kind of products to add and how much based on what crop you plan to grow and if you prefer organic or conventional amendments. Samples sent to the UMaine Soil Testing Service also get checked for harmful levels of lead.
If I'm in a rush, do I have to mail my soil sample to the lab? Or can I just use one of those at-home test kits from the hardware store?
Besides having limited accuracy, the issue with at-home soil test kits, like the ones you can buy for pH, is that they don't take into account all the soil characteristics needed to make a recommendation. Soil results from your state soil lab take into account your local soil characteristics and growing conditions, so you know there'll be a return on investment for the money that you spend on amendments.
Is it too late to send in a soil test for this year?
It's definitely not. Although doing your soil test in the fall gives you more time, doing one in the spring still provides a lot of valuable information for that growing season.
Do I just take a scoop of dirt and mail it in?
The soil lab you plan to use will have instructions on how to take a soil sample, including sample depth and number of samples, based on what you plan to grow. It's important to get a sample that's representative of the whole area, so you should take multiple subsamples and mix them really well.
When I get my soil test results back, what's the first thing I should address?
The first thing I always look at is pH. pH is critical because it determines how available key plant nutrients are. So before you start adding fertilizer, you may want to make sure your pH is correct. Most Maine soils are naturally acidic, so unless you are growing an acid-loving crop, it's likely you may need to raise your soil's pH.
What should I purchase to change soil pH?
The soil test results will tell you if you need lime to raise your pH or sulfur to lower it, and how much. If you do need lime, your soil test may recommend dolomitic lime if you also need magnesium. Because lime takes a long time to fully react, up to 6 months, it's best to apply in the fall. You can spread it by hand or the lawn spreader. Just make sure you're wearing proper protective equipment. Ideally, incorporate it into the top 6 to 8 inches of the soil.
Can I use wood ashes?
Wood ashes will raise the pH of your garden, so you want to apply them only if your soil test shows that you need to raise your pH. They are less effective per pound at raising pH than lime, so you will likely need to apply more. However, this will also vary based on the source of the ash, so start conservatively, test yearly to see if you need to add more. Always wear the proper protective equipment for applying an alkaline substance like lime or wood ash.
What else is important when preparing your garden soil?
The next thing I look at is whether the soil test calls for adding plant nutrients. Nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium are the nutrients needed in the largest amounts and most likely to limit the productivity of your garden. They call these macronutrients. Magnesium, sulfur, and calcium are secondary nutrients. Your soil test will tell you if and how much of these to add. There are lots of micronutrients, which are only needed in tiny amounts. Luckily for us, most of them are abundant in Maine soils, so they rarely limit plant growth.
What kind of fertilizer should I buy?
That depends on if you prefer conventional or organic options. For conventional fertilizers, try to find one that most closely matches the recommendation on your soil test. If your test recommends a 10-10-10, this is referring to the guaranteed analysis of the fertilizer. This is the amount of the nitrogen, the phosphorus in the form of phosphate, and potassium in the form of potash that the fertilizer contains. So a 10-10-10 is 10% nitrogen, 10% phosphate, and 10% potash. You can also think of it as 10 pounds of nitrogen in a 100-pound bag of fertilizer.
What if I prefer to use organic fertilizers?
Because organic fertilizers derive directly from plant and animal sources, they tend to have lower levels of nutrients that are released more slowly. This means you'll need to apply more. Organic fertilizer options include things like blood meal, fish emulsion, processed and pelletized poultry manure. There's lots of other options. See the resources for this video for a list of organic nutrient sources. Unlike conventional fertilizers, organic ones tend to have different amounts of nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium that may or may not line up exactly with what you need to apply. To keep things simple, apply the fertilizer based on the nitrogen needs of your garden, because this is the thing that's most likely to limit growth. Then add supplemental phosphorus and potassium if needed.
Can I use manure as fertilizer?
Manure is a good source of plant nutrients, but it also contains pathogens that can cause disease. This happens when animal manure comes into contact with fresh fruits and vegetables. There are ways to safely use manure. Use composted manure, especially packaged manure that has been labeled as pathogen-free. Also, if you plan to apply raw manure, including aged manure that hasn't been properly composted, apply it at least 120 days before you plan to harvest your crop. For crops that don't come into direct contact with the soil, something like tomatoes, you could apply a manure 90 days before harvest. For Maine, this means the best time to apply manure is actually the fall before. You can apply and incorporate it following it with a cover crop, ideally before October 1st. Another is never use raw manure to side dress growing plants. Also, make sure to properly wash your hands anytime you come in from the garden, as well as your produce before you eat it.
How about using compost as a fertilizer?
You can't really think of compost as a fertilizer because it releases nutrients really slowly. But there's still tons of great reasons to add it to your garden. When you add compost, you're adding organic matter, and organic matter improves soil structure and increases the nutrient and moisture holding capacity of your soil.
That sounds great. So I should probably add as much compost as possible.
You can have too much of a good thing. The typical range for soil organic matter is only 5 to 8%. If your organic matter levels get too high, you can experience issues. Research shows that there is no benefit from applying really high rates of compost, so save your money. You'll only need about 6 cubic feet per 1,000 square feet of garden beds. That's about 5 to 6 bags. The final application rate should look like pepper on mashed potatoes.
Once I've picked the fertilizer, when do I apply it?
For vegetables, you want to apply your fertilizer as close to planting time as possible and incorporate it into the top 6 to 8 inches of soil. Rain can leach out nitrogen if you apply it too early. Leaching is when water from rain or irrigation dissolves nutrients in the soil and carries them downwards. Picture making coffee. The water that runs through the grounds doesn't come out clear because it's dissolving substances from the coffee grounds, which end up in your coffee pot. The only exception that we mentioned earlier is that you wouldn't want to apply manure right before planting.
So I'm applying all my nutrients at the beginning of the growing season. After that, my plants are all set?
Some plants benefit from side dressing with nitrogen. This is a mid-season application of nitrogen applied to the surface of the soil. Just make sure not to apply it directly against the stem of the plant. And if you do plan to do a mid-season application, reduce your spring application of nitrogen accordingly.
Besides the pH and fertility of my soil, what else should I think about?
You want to worry about soil organic matter. It's very important.
I saw that on my soil test. What does that mean?
Soil organic matter is everything in your soil that is or was once living. So picture worms, bacteria, plant roots, leaves, and stems from previous year's plants. Some of it's relatively fresh, but some has been broken down over time by the organisms in your soil that decompose things. Even though it makes up a relatively small proportion of your garden soil, on average it's only about 5%, it has a disproportionately large effect on soil properties. It does all kinds of great things. Soil organic matter helps create aggregates, which are clumps of soil. Aggregates help make soil loose and easily worked. Plus, they create pore space, which provides good soil drainage and aeration. We don't often think of it, but plant roots need oxygen too. They don't actually want to be in totally saturated soil all of the time. Organic matter also holds moisture and plant nutrients, acting like a slow-release bank of fertilizer for your plants. Finally, organic matter acts as a key food source for soil microorganisms that we need to cycle plant nutrients and break down dead plants and organisms.
That sounds great. My soil test shows that my organic matter is low. What can I do to increase it?
You can increase soil organic matter by adding manure, compost, cover crops, leaves, or other organic material. One thing to be aware of with all additions of organic materials to your garden, incorporating materials rich in carbon like wood chips can temporarily tie up the nitrogen in your soil as those soil microorganisms break down the amendment that you've added. So watch out for yellowing of the leaves, also known as chlorosis. It's a symptom of nitrogen deficiency, and you can add supplemental nitrogen if it's necessary. And it's important to maintain your existing organic matter. You can do this by avoiding tilling excessively. Over time, this speeds up the natural breakdown process of the organic matter.
But I thought I was supposed to rototill my garden every fall or spring to loosen the soil.
Rototilling can be necessary when you're first establishing a garden, and it's a great way to incorporate cover crop, lime, and fertilizer. But interestingly, rototilling your soil too often can actually make soil structure worse over time. In the short term, it's going to create a lighter, fluffier surface to work with. But long term, you're actually destroying the structure that is naturally created by earthworms and other soil microorganisms. Imagine walking through a forest, and the ground is soft and bouncy beneath your feet. No one's rototilling that soil, and plants are able to grow in it with no problem. Bottom line, keep rototilling to a minimum and save it for when you really need it, like incorporating something into the soil.
I see a lot of products advertised that will improve my soil. Are they worth the money?
It depends. Are they addressing a known issue with your soil, like raising your pH or adding a nutrient that is below the ideal level for plant growth? If not, you might want to save your money. I advocate a conservative approach when it comes to adding things to your soil. Once you've added something, there's no taking it back, and there can be negative consequences to over-applying some materials.
What if my soil is too wet? Can I add anything to fix this?
If your soil is wet because of a high water table, your best bet's going to be a tall, raised bed that gets those plant roots out of the saturated zone. Your plant will be much happier. On the other hand, if your soil is wet because of a lot of clay, amending your soil can help.
So would I just add sand to improve drainage?
Actually, no. Adding sand will not necessarily fix your soil. In fact, it may make it harder to work with. On the other hand, a relatively small amount of additional organic matter can improve soil drainage by improving soil structure, which helps soil drain.
I actually have the opposite problem. My yard is really sandy. It's like a desert. What can I add?
Amazingly, for a very sandy soil, you need the same thing, organic matter. Organic matter not only helps improve soil structure, it also retains moisture, which is really helpful in a drought-prone soil.
You mentioned building a raised bed. What do I fill it with?
So unlike containers, which you can fill with soilless media, you need some mineral soil in a raised bed. Otherwise, it can turn into a wet sponge. Plus, that would get really expensive. You can use your own garden soil or purchase topsoil, but just make sure it's good quality. And you can add compost too, ideally about 10 to 20% of the total volume. Annual crop roots rarely reach more than 18 inches deep. So if your raised bed is deeper than that, you can consider filling the bottom with drainage or aeration material to decrease the chance of the soil at the bottom staying soggy and creating issues. Lastly, it's a good idea to perform a soil test on your raised beds.
Thank you, Marjorie, Laurie, and Becca. So to recap, get your garden soil tested by a reputable lab. Add soil amendments based on those recommendations. Start by correcting soil pH if necessary. Next, add any needed plant nutrients. If your soil organic matter is low, increase it by adding compost, using cover crops, or using other organic amendments. Finally, keep rototilling to a minimum. More information is available on the University of Maine Cooperative Extension's website and in the notes for this video. Please be sure to check out the next video in this series, Get Planting.